Christine and Chaim for inviting me down here to Miami for this wonderful weather. I left a blizzard and came to a hailstorm. I wanted to fill you in briefly on Scholars for Peace in the Middle East because it's somewhat germane to the discussion this evening. We have approximately 30,000 members on 3,200 campuses around the world. We deal with faculty, not with students, because our belief is that students come and go from a university. Faculty are there for the duration and have the ability and influence to make change on a campus by helping administrators see the errors of their ways and changing policies and changing teaching programs and curricula and so forth. Scholars for Peace in the Middle East was founded about 12 years ago when it was obvious that in the academy, scholarship was being perverted and degraded in order to fulfill some people's politicization of scholarship and a changing of teaching in order to fulfill someone's opinion about how the world should be. And our mission is to correct the misperceptions about history, to look at professors that use their classrooms as places of propaganda in order to propagandize and indoctrinate students as opposed to teaching them how to think, particularly with regard to the Middle East and specifically with the way that Israel is treated in the classroom and on campuses, not only by student activists and Muslim student associations and Students for Justice in Palestine, but also by radical faculty, many of whom were behind the boycott that Chaim just mentioned that was passed by the American Studies Association. It's a small association of 5,000 members, but they made a huge statement in saying that of all the academics around the world, not in Korea, in North Korea, not in China, not in Egypt, not in Saudi Arabia, not in any university system where there's oppression and gender apartheid and the absence of women and the indoctrination of students by faculty that are controlled by the state. No, none of those were worthy of being boycotted. Only in Israel, the Middle East's only democracy. So one of our reactions as an organization, and this was also complemented by 190 college and university presidents denouncing the boycott, was to call them on their action and say, hey, this is not what academic freedom is about. It's based on propaganda and lies and a distortion of history. So Scholars for Peace in the Middle East has as its mission to rid academia of this degradation of scholarship, the politicization of scholarship, for the ends of demonizing Israel and attacking America and the West and colonial empires and imperialism and all those other perceived maladies that people on the left and that much of the Arab world ascribes to the West and our proxy in the Middle East, Israel. Tonight, I wanted to go over my area of interest and my specialty, which is what's happening on campuses regarding the demonization and delegitimization of Israel. And what it involves is a very complex, as Chaim pointed out, what we call a cognitive war against Israel, not a war with guns and missiles, which America and Israel could easily win against any enemies. But the cognitive war is more pernicious. And it's much more dangerous on campuses because it comes from people who most of us ordinarily would expect to tell the truth. It comes from professors teaching at Ivy League universities like Harvard and Yale and Columbia and Berkeley, where we would expect people with PhDs who are teaching at some of the greatest universities in the world to be speaking the truth. But in fact, they've enlisted the university as a co-enabler of this destruction of truth in this cognitive war against Israel. And it's resulted in what my colleague Richard Landis calls a lethal narrative, that the Palestinian narrative that Palestinianism itself, which is this worldwide movement abetted by Western elites to make sacred the cause of the Palestinians in the war against Israel, is part of this process of creating a false or perverted or inverted narrative about Israel. Some of you may be familiar with the book by the great British commentator Melanie Phillips. Her latest book is called The World Turned Upside Down. And I think it's very relevant to tonight's discussion. In it, she's a resident of Britain, and Britain is having its own problems because they've embraced multiculturalism and the influx of many Muslims into Britain to such an extent, and not wanting to offend this new influx of new ethnicity into England, that in her view, they've given up the values of Western culture and civilization that Britain created to a large extent. The rule of law, open and transparent press, and so forth. But what she talks about in respect to Israel specifically, and the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, is that the world has been turned upside down. That Israel is called a racist regime, yet in the West Bank, an Arab gets the death penalty for selling land to a Jew. That Israel is considered to be an apartheid state, yet Mahmoud Abbas gets up and has, on multiple occasions, proclaimed that in the new Palestinian state, not one Jew will be allowed to live. This is the world turned upside down. And what Phillips says, and she calls it a dialogue of the demented, that history and events that have happened in our lifetime are totally forgotten, as if it was ancient history. That the true victim has been Israel all of this time, with an onslaught of Arab nations that have, since its birth, been trying and willing to obliterate it. And now that hostility of Arab nations that was started with guns and terrorism is being abetted by these co-conspirators on campuses of well-meaning but misguided liberals and activists and radicals who feel that the Palestinian cause is so worthy that it's worth sacrificing a sovereign nation of Israel in order to achieve self-determination for the Palestinians. There are countless examples that I can give of this. Obviously, I wrote a whole book about this, so there's more than enough material. Tonight, I wanted to show you, by showing you some graphics that will show you some of the recurring motifs that are ways in which the propagandists on the other side are using the Palestinian cause as a way of degrading, delegitimizing, slandering, libeling, and weakening Israel, with the ultimate intention that it becomes so weak, that it becomes such a pariah nation, that it becomes the enemy of mankind from a moral perspective, then no one will care if it goes away. If it's subsumed either by a binational one-state solution, which some people propose, or if it's just eliminated by its enemies because Israel has become the new Nazi of the world, that it has no moral right to exist, that it stole the land on which it exists, that it expelled an indigenous people, that it acts in a brutal, oppressive manner, humiliates an indigenous population of Palestinian Arabs who have been robbed of their birthright and have no ability to travel, have lost their property, cannot return to their homes. And it does this in flagrant violation of all the sanctions that are put on it by the United Nations and all of those other fair-minded bodies of the world. So the danger in this constant demonization of Israel is that if enough people believe that the allegations are true, no one is going to be concerned when the enemy of peace on earth gets what is due to them. That's the danger of not standing up to the lies. And that's what's in its own way, Scholars for Peace in the Middle East does on the campuses, that when lies are told, that when teaching is contorted, when a panel discussion is held at Brooklyn College, sponsored by the Political Science Department, and the panel discussion has two panelists, both of whom are not academics and are well-known anti-Israel, anti-Semitic activists who want to destroy Israel, that's a problem in the university. That's not scholarly debate about Israel and Palestine. That's one-sided, biased propaganda to indoctrinate students with the approval of a university, and a university department saying, in essence, effectively, this is acceptable, this is the truth. I like to start by showing this particular poster, which is from an Israel Apartheid Week, which now every March takes place on at least 24 campuses around the world. And for a week, there's demonstrations and mock apartheid walls, and even the name Israel Apartheid Week makes the assumption that in fact apartheid exists in Israel, that somehow Israel has become the new South Africa, and that it's incumbent upon all of us as well-meaning, social justice-seeking liberals to do the same thing to Israel that we did to South Africa, to release the blacks there from the bondage that they experienced at the hands of the white Afrikaners. And so this label of apartheid is both disingenuous and false, but it's very inflammatory. And it's used widely in this poster. But what I wanted to show you is how this poster encapsulates many of the themes that we see in the entire lethal narrative that I mentioned before, about how the Palestinian narrative has eclipsed Israel's own narrative in defense of itself. Israel is always depicted in these kinds of propagandistic posters as a faceless, humanless object. Here it's an Apache attack helicopter. The Arabs, or the Palestinian, is shown as an innocent. It's a child holding a teddy bear who never did anything wrong, never strapped a suicide vest to his chest, never blew up a pizza parlor in Tel Aviv, or a Seder at the Park Hotel. The Arabs have never done anything. They were just victims. Look at the wall surrounding them. It looks like a concentration camp. That evil apartheid wall, not a security barrier that's 80% chain link fence, an apartheid wall, as if it was built to keep colored Arabs out of white Jewish neighborhoods. Again, the apartheid label confirms the idea that Israelis are racist, that Zionism, as it was deemed in 1972, is in fact racism, that Zionism is a racist ideology which pits superior white Jews against colored Arabs. It's preposterous. And anybody here who's been to Israel knows that the ethnicity of Israel is diverse and complex. And there's not white people, there's brown people, there's black people, there's all color people. There's no apartheid there. It's not institutionalized by the state at any rate. So this image of a sadistic, brutal, militarily oriented Israel without human form, barbaric, murdering an innocent Arab child, is an extension of the old medieval blood libel that Christians used to affix to Jews in the Middle Ages when they accused them of killing Christian children for their blood, for Passover matzah, or throwing them down wells. This is the blood libel reinvented. And this, as Chaim alluded to earlier, is not just about criticism of Israel. This is saying that the Jewish state is a murderer. The Jewish state is immoral. The Jewish state is racist. Israel, in fact, is the Jewish state, as Netanyahu and others insist on having everybody recognize. If you detest Israel and everything it stands for, you have to detest Jews. So I like to show this poster as a beginning standpoint. It's a little less subtle than some of the other attacks on Israel. which are done by professors and writers and pseudo-scholars and lecturers. This is done by students, and it was quite controversial when it came out, but I think it's indicative of the type of images that we see. I teach marketing, and all of you know what a brand is, and when a company has a brand, we want to build the reputation of the brand. We want to enhance the visibility of the brand. The brand is what people associate. It's the association someone has with a product. Well, countries are branded as well, and for the same reason that products are, because governments want people to visit the countries as tourists. They want businesses to come and do business there. It's good for a company or a country to brand itself in a positive way. This guy in England, Simon Anholt, every year does a brand index of countries, and he does an online survey with thousands of respondents and has them rate based on a number of criteria: desirability, the culture, your impressions of the country, and so forth. A number of countries, over 30 countries. And who do you think comes out at the bottom every year? You know, below China, below Yemen, below North Korea. How can that be? A thriving Western-style democracy in a sea of totalitarian maladies, with more venture capital companies only than any other country except the United States, a free press, open schools, good hospitals, a standard of living just like ours. If you went to a mall in Tel Aviv, you could be in Miami, like the mall we just went to. But it comes out last. Why? Because my theory is that Israel's brand has been hijacked. There's a concept in marketing called brand hijack. Another, Alex Wipperfurth, wrote a book called Brand Hijack. He's a marketing expert. His concept was that certain brands like Apple Computers and Harley Davidsons and Doc Marten boots and Barbie dolls, certain brands have consumers that are so in love with the brand itself, that they love it so much, that they take over the marketing. They hijack the marketing. And companies love this to happen, because if you tell me that an Apple computer is the best that you've ever had, I believe you more than I believe Apple telling me it's good. So that's what brand hijacking is. My theory is, in the case of Israel, Israel's brand has been hijacked also, but it's been hijacked by the enemies of Israel. This false narrative about what Israel is and what it has done and how it treats the Palestinians and how it exists in the community of nations has been hijacked. So this is the way that Israel brands itself. This spread on the left was done by Maxim magazine about 6 or 7 years ago. Maxim magazine is for college-age boys and a little older. It's a junior version of Playboy. These are women of the IDF. They were soldiers in the IDF. The idea was, and David Seranga, who was the consul general of Israel at the time, came up with this idea. He wanted to reach young people when they were young enough to not have opinions about Israel, so that they might have positive opinions. And here's, typical tourist posters. This is how Israel probably is, and this is definitely how Israel would like to be perceived. This is its brand as it would like to be. This is the brand that Israel currently has in the world, based not only on that survey, but you'll see based on everything else that we're going to talk about tonight. This billboard on the left was this was in America. It's called stop30billion.com. It was the amount of money that would be given to Israel over 10 years, $3 billion a year. Tell Congress, stop killing children. No more military aid to Israel. Innocent Arab child, militaristic, faceless, Israeli, Nazi-like murderer of children. Stop killing children. That's all that the Israelis do for fun, is take tanks and go out and shoot Arab children. Here you have a Palestinian at a humiliating checkpoint They're always talking about how humiliating they are. Why are there checkpoints there? Why is there an apartheid wall there? Israel didn't build them to be malicious. Israel built the wall because it reduced terrorism by 90%. And if Palestinian Arabs had not been going into Israeli neighborhoods and blowing civilians up, they wouldn't have built the wall. There wouldn't be checkpoints if there wasn't terrorism. There wouldn't be an occupation had there not been Arab aggression. Terrorism is not the result of the occupation. The occupation is the result of terrorism that predated the occupation. And here, again, this is almost iconic, this picture of a boy with a stone. All we have is a stone against your tank, and you're so mean. So you heard this after Operation Cast Lead in 2008 and 2009. Israel left Gaza in 2005, turned it over to the Palestinians. Hamas turned it into the world's largest launching pad for missiles, and 12,000 missiles had rained down into southern Israeli towns. In Sderot, 46% of the children there have post-traumatic stress disorder because of bombs falling in their neighborhoods. These are rockets not shot at soldiers, shot into neighborhoods, at schoolyards, to kill Jews, not to kill soldiers of Israel, to kill Jews randomly because they're Jewish. Shot over there by someone that's not even an army, that wears no uniforms and that hides in the civilians' homes. So Israel finally says enough is enough and suppresses that, kills 700 terrorists out of 1,200 Gazans that are killed. It's a tragic loss of life for the Gazans, but Hamas hid itself and embedded itself in civilian neighborhoods, knowing full well that Israel, even after they took heroic methods to minimize civilian casualties, would kill civilians. And they were willing to let their fellow Gazans be killed because they knew it would be good public relations for their cause. So what happened after that incursion? Israel was universally denounced. It was disproportionate reaction. Do you think if Mexican revolutionaries were shooting rockets into southern Texas towns, it would have taken America 5 years and 12,000 rockets killing some Texans before we went down to suppress that? Do you think we would have cared if the world had said, oh, you killed some innocent civilians there? It's not incumbent upon an army when they are suppressing attacks against them to even care about collateral damage. They always do, but it's not incumbent upon them to do. It's not disproportionate to suppress enemy hostile fire into your neighborhoods to protect the lives of your citizens. Erwin Cutler, who I saw is either coming, he's coming? He's a wonderful, wonderful speaker, a great man, a very kind-hearted, soft-spoken guy. And he made the observation that I thought was very telling, that the greatest crime of the 20th century was to be accused of being a racist. And that's why it's so important for the enemies of Israel to constantly call it an apartheid state. And he said that racism had its most profound manifestations in the 20th century in apartheid and Nazism. And isn't it interesting who's randomly and promiscuously accused of being an apartheid nation and acting like Nazis? The new Nazis. One of the speakers who you're going to see in a few minutes at a California campus is pointing to Jews on an American campus, pointing to them and saying, y'all are the new Nazis. Y'all are the new Nazis? Why? Because I'm Jewish? Because I'm pro-Israel? Accusing Jews and Israelis specifically of being Nazis is doubly insane. My colleague Richard Landis, who I referred to before, he calls this moral sadism, that you are ascribing to some of the victims of actual Nazism the same behavior. In fact, you see sometimes some of these anti-Israel writers and speakers will make comments like, you learned your lessons very well from your former oppressors. Or they make this false analogy that Gaza is the new Auschwitz. You'll see some posters later on, as if Gaza is some kind of an enclosed prison camp that is similar in any way to Auschwitz. Meanwhile, the 600,000 original Palestinian refugees that supposedly left Israel are now between 6 and 8 million. What kind of a Nazi campaign has that been? Not very successful if we're committing genocide against the poor Palestinians when they've gone from 400,000 to 6 million. The U.S. State Department has what they call a working definition of anti-Semitism. And Chaim alluded to this earlier when he was introducing me, that we're dealing with something now that we refer to in the business as the new anti-Semitism. And the new anti-Semitism is not the same as it was when we were growing up. After the Holocaust, it was no longer fashionable for people, unless you were particularly weird. And there are some people on the far right and some on the far left who outwardly say, I just don't like Jews. It's not fashionable, it's not polite, it's not publicly acceptable to do that. However, it's extremely acceptable to say, oh, I have no problem with Jews. Some of my best friends are Jews. And in fact, Jews say this themselves. It's those barbaric, subhuman, racist, apartheid-loving, Nazi-like Israelis that I detest. So the new anti-Semitism is anti-Semitism through the prism of a discussion about Israel, the Jewish state. And as much as people try to beg around this and to duck and weave, the reality is that many people, not all, there are well-meaning people that are misguided and have fallen into this false narrative by the Palestinians. But there are people who are able to express their anti-Semitism now as a discussion of critique of Israel. And that's why it's a very difficult problem for many of us on the other side, and particularly for college administrators and chairmen of departments and others to readily identify real anti-Semitism where it exists, as opposed to a debate about Israel. But if you look at some of the materials that I'm going to be showing you here, there's no way that anyone could look at this and say, oh, this is just a discussion about whether the 67 border should be here or the 49 border should be here, or where the checkpoint should be, or should there be land swaps. That's not what's going on here. This is a demonization, a delegitimization, and a huge double standard. And the double standard was brought out very clearly in the American Studies Association boycott. When they had decided they were going to go after Israel, and the New York Times reporter said, why Israel? Why not go after North Korea or China or Tibet or Saudi Arabia or all the countries in the world where there's huge academic problems, no academic freedom, you're going after Israel. And the president said, well, you have to start somewhere. Well, he wanted to start somewhere because there's a double standard. And the double standard is that the enemies of Israel hold it up to a standard that they apply to no other nation. It's okay to criticize Israel. People within Israel criticize it all the time. We can debate fairly about any country, about its weaknesses and its strength. But the level of enmity against Israel, the obsession with its many perceived and ascribed defects, and the ignoring of other countries that are doing far worse things, including the Palestinians themselves. One has to wonder why so many people could be behind the people that rejected statehood in 1937, in 1947, in 1967, in 2000, in 2005. Statehood was offered to them. They could have had a state any time between 1948 and 1967 when Jordan controlled the West Bank and Egypt controlled Gaza. They could have been granted statehood then. Why was there no call for a state then? Because there was no Palestinians then. It had not been conceived as a bludgeoning tool against Israel. The important thing about the working definition of anti-Semitism is not just someone saying, you're a cheap Jew, I don't like hikes, or that type of old anti-Semitism. I don't like Jews because they're sneaky, or they stick together, or they run the banks, or they control the media. Now it's been diffused, it's disguised, and it's more pernicious because it comes off as what is purported to be authentic debate about Israel, but is in fact another more virulent, cancerous form of raw anti-Semitism. So a number of things have happened within the university that play their own roles, but they're all playing part of the same role of demonizing Israel, weakening the perception of Israel, contorting scholarship about Israel, and so forth. One of the problems that we see in Scholars for Peace in the Middle East, because we deal with faculty and because we only deal with university corruption of scholarship, is in departments of Middle East studies. Middle East studies, as described in this book by Martin Kramer, who was a bright student of Haim, I just learned tonight, Ivory Towers in the Sand, is a huge indictment of the Middle Eastern studies departments around the world, and particularly in the United States and in Britain, where whole departments have been hijacked and filled with pseudo-academics, academics recruited from the Middle East, who have very little authentic scholarship and who have a political agenda in order to demonize the West, and they're typically anti-American, anti-Western, anti-imperialistic, and clearly anti-Israel, if not anti-Semitic, in their approach. And as Ruth Wise once put it, they are also obsessed with the obsession of Palestinianism. That if you go to a conference and there's all of this turmoil in the Middle East, many of the papers, a bulk of the papers, will be about the Palestinian question. What's so important about that? You know, the State Department and many people act as if some Jewish residents in the West Bank building some extra apartments is going to cause the next world war. Why is that? Why is that important as opposed to what's going on in the streets of Cairo, or the fact that 120,000 people have been slaughtered in Syria in the near term? Do you know in the 65 years of the Palestinian-Arab conflict that all of the fatalities, including the 67 war and the War of Independence, is only 49th on the list of a number of fatalities? Do you know what that number is? 49,000 killed. I mean, it's a big number, but it's tiny compared to the Iraq-Iran war, where 1 million people were killed in a much shorter amount of time. But in the public's imagination, and if you, Alan Dershowitz once said, if a stranger came down from Mars and heard about Israel, they would think it was, you know, the most important and the most horrible state on earth, based on the way that its influence is inflated. The other point that Haim mentioned at dinner tonight also is, because Islam has been well funded by petrodollars, they have taken it upon themselves to promote a favorable view of the Arab world and an unfavorable view of the enemies of the Arab world, meaning the West, the infidels, and specifically Israel, which is like a wound on the pride of the Arab world for being an autonomous Jewish state in a sea of Arab lands. I'm always astounded when you think of the size of Israel, also just in terms of geographic size. You know what the size of Israel is? It's about 8,000 square miles, the size of New Jersey. The Arab world is 1.5 million square miles. This is not a debate about land. Nobody cares about the 49 border or the 67 border. It's about there being a Jewish autonomous state in what Islam perceives to be holy Muslim land that was seized by the infidel, and worse than the infidel, the Jew, and that needs to come back. It's not a discussion about borders. And the reality is that Hamas, Hezbollah, and most of the PLO, probably, if you were in a room with them and they were speaking honestly, don't care about two states living side by side in peace. They don't care about a Palestinian state. What they care about is extirpating the Jewish state. The end of the Jewish state is the goal here, not the creation of the Palestinian state. This list is much longer. I gave a small abbreviated list, and I'm sure it's gone above $200 million now. Does this mean that they're buying off professors? No. But in the case of Georgetown, for example, which is the Center for Christian Islamic Understanding, it's called, is headed by John Esposito. He's a very genteel guy. He does testimony to the State Department. He's at Georgetown, you know, a very reputable university. He took $20 million from bin Talal. He's never met a terrorist that he thought was a terrorist. He's an apologist for Islam and for radical Islam. He never saw it coming. He still doesn't think it's a threat. He doesn't think it's here. So did the $20 million buy his complicity? No, but you can be certain that the kinds of guests that he will invite, you can be certain that the kinds of scholars in residence that he will have come to his center, you can be sure that the lectures that he has at his center and that the teaching and courses offered there are going to reflect his worldview, which is clearly shared by the donors, who have a very strong Wahhabist worldview, which is extremely virulent and not very nuanced. Here's two other examples of why this academic cognitive war against Israel is dangerous. It's dangerous because it's not being perpetrated by guys like the Ku Klux Klan who run around with sheets on their heads, or by skinheads who live in their mother's basement. It's being perpetrated and promoted and enhanced by people from the University of Chicago and Harvard University and Barnard. So the book on the left, I'm sure all of you are familiar with this. It was written by John Mearsheimer and Stephen Walt, Harvard School, Kennedy School of Government and University of Chicago. It purports that America's support of Israel is fundamentally a bad thing for us, that it has gained us enemies in the world, that we have no moral obligation to support them, that we shouldn't be supporting them, that it's hurt us internationally, and that the only reason we do support them is because there's this clandestine group working in the background, pulling the strings of Congress and influencing government and government officials to make us do things that are good for Israel and bad for America. Does this sound like a book that was written during the Tsarist period called The Protocols of the Elders of Zion? A forgery which purported that a Jewish conspiracy was planning on taking over the world, and they were going to run nations from behind the scenes and control the banks, and they had total control of the presses and the media. And these two Ivy League professors from some of the most reputable schools in the world wrote this book, which was a redoing of the Protocols of the Elder of Zion. Went to the top of the bestseller list while they were claiming that the Israel lobby was going to suppress what they were saying because it was so dangerous, and and no one wanted the secret to get out. This was a slander against American Jews who were accused of caring more about Israel than their own country. This double loyalty accusation that's often made against Jews, particularly that because they have no country, that they're kind of a citizen of all countries, that they're not loyal to anybody and that they can't be trusted. The other book by Nadia El-Haj was written as a master's thesis. She used it to get tenure at Barnard. Was written by a woman about archaeology in Jerusalem and in Israel. She's not an archaeologist. She's a political advocate for the Palestinian Authority, which she admits at the foreword of the book. Her thesis is that there was no biblical, historical Jewish connection to Jerusalem or Israel at all. That it was invented By whom? By unscrupulous, crafty, sneaky Jewish archaeologists who created a false history by creating facts on the ground which weren't real. Exactly what she's trying to do for the Palestinian cause. Why did she write this book? Not to make a contribution to archaeology. She wrote this book as a way of elevating the Palestinians' claim to Jerusalem and the Holy Land over and above that of the Jews. Why? Because if the Jews' claim to Israel can be dismissed, that's one more reason they shouldn't be there. They stole the land. They only got the land as a reward for the Holocaust. Even Obama, in his speech in Cairo, sort of suggested that this Israel was created, as a result of the Holocaust. Well, in a way, but it wasn't a reward for it. And the Arabs like to say, why are you making us responsible for what the Nazis did? Because we have to have this Jewish state here now because of the Holocaust, even while they're denying that the Holocaust happened. The danger of books like this is it perpetrates lies and distortions about Jews and about Israel specifically, and then it ascribes to them an accusation of being treasonous, underhanded, working behind the scenes, or of trying to invent a history to promote their own political agenda, as she did in Facts on the Ground. I was talking about this at dinner too. I don't know if any of you have heard of this term, pinkwashing. I want to show you this because this is one of the more egregious examples of how criticism of Israel even takes place when Israel is seemingly doing something good. So this woman, Sarah Schulman, is a professor at City University of New York. The New York Times published this op-ed piece. The New York Times op-ed page is one of the most valuable journalistic pieces of real estate in the world. They select 3 or 4 articles a day, and they have thousands of writers all over the world that would be dying to be on those pages. What do they pick? This woman, who's a queer theorist and a lesbian feminist, and her idea is that, Israel pretends to be so gay friendly. They have gay pride parades in Jerusalem, and it's a very good place for gays to go, as opposed to, say, Saudi Arabia or Iran, where you can be hung or flogged for being gay. And she said, you know why they're doing that? Not because they really care about that. They're just talking about how gay friendly they are because they want to hide their crimes and obscure their oppression of the Palestinians. So she calls this, instead of whitewashing, she calls it pinkwashing. I mean, how much mental gymnastics do you have to do to come up with a theory like that, that even when a country is doing something which normally we would say is a good thing, you turn it into something bad? Or, more incredibly, this student at Hebrew University, a sociology student, wrote a master's thesis, and she did a survey of the incidence of rape in the IDF, in the Israeli Armed Forces, and she found out that it was an all-time low compared to other countries. Again, wouldn't you say, wow, that's a great thing. Here you've got the army that's considered to be Nazis, and yet the incidence of them raping Arab women is one of the lowest in the world. No, it's not a good thing, actually, she says. The reason they don't rape the Arab women is because they're so racist, they don't want to touch them. She won an award for this thesis. So this tells you something, first of all, about the thinking that goes on about Israel. Second of all, that it's embraced by both universities and the New York Times, for example. And that it's awarded. And it's distinguished by making it into a book, as in the case of Facts on the Ground, or getting a prize for a master's thesis, or getting published in the New York Times, one of the great world's newspapers. It used to be. So, some of you might remember or have heard about this Florida Atlantic University. This has happened at other schools as well. The thing that was troubling about this particular incident was Jewish students woke up and found these eviction notices put on their door, and they were distributed by Students for Justice in Palestine. we believe that they were escorted around by the housing office people, which is a little disturbing. For example, how would they have identified Jewish students and so forth? This is more of the theatrical type of thing that's done by radical student groups. But in targeting Jewish students and making them feel unwanted and causing them to think that the Israeli government is randomly throwing people out of their houses for no reason, it perpetrates this perception of Israel being morally bad. This is one of the most egregious examples of student activism. This was a poster. It's a soup can with a dead Palestinian baby in it. Said, with Ariel Sharon's name, made in Israel, Palestinian children meat, slaughtered according to Jewish rights under American license. In other words, America is culpable because we support Israel with the $3 billion a year in aid that we give them. This is a perfect example of the medieval blood libel that I talked to you about earlier when we were looking at that first poster. The idea that Israelis arbitrarily, randomly, and sadistically kill Arabs for fun, and particularly children who are totally innocent. Totally innocent. And we know, and it's been revealed many times, that the bodies of dead children that have died from other incidents, not unrelated to the Israeli military, have been paraded out for the press, and the press automatically believes it when it's shown. But this was at San Francisco State University, on the campus. You know, this is not a debate about Israel. This is something else going on. This is not a scholarly debate. This is not an academic discussion. Here's another example at Berkeley. It's the same picture, just a different take on it. 22% of the thousands of Palestinians killed by Israel and 35% of the tens of thousands injured are under the age of 18. Well, that might have something to do, as I alluded to before, by the fact that none of the terrorists wear uniforms. They don't fight on the battlefield. They don't shoot at soldiers. They hide in civilian neighborhoods, or they store their weapons there, knowing full well, or they use human shields, knowing full well that they're going to get a lot of press benefit by Israel murdering their children and their families. So concurrent with and as part of this cognitive war against Israel is this assault on Israel's moral right to exist, and this compulsion that the pro-Palestinians have of trying to make the Palestinians into the new Jews, that they've reversed places, that the Jew is now the Nazi and the Palestinian is the Jew. So they called this event with the wonderful Professor Norman Finkelstein, who Edward Alexander called the dream Jew of anti-Semites. His parents were Holocaust survivors. He called Elie Wiesel a clown, and he thinks that everybody involved in Holocaust education are hucksters who are doing it for monetary profit. So he speaks probably every week at a university by Muslim student associations, Students for Justice in Palestine. It's very busy. But they had this particular event called Holocaust in the Holy Land. Well, who's perpetrating the Holocaust? Not the Palestinian terrorists, the Jews, the Israelis, in committing genocide and ethnic cleansing on the Palestinians. Those same Palestinians, as I mentioned, that went from 400,000 to 8 million are having a genocide against them. And here, we see this all the time, the juxtaposition of the Jewish star and the swastika. Because it's a powerful symbol. Everybody understands what the swastika is. There's probably no more powerful evil symbol. Can you think of one? There's none. In modern times, that is the ultimate evil. So here it's being superimposed repeatedly with the Jewish star. University of California at Irvine, and we're going to see this guy in a minute, Malik Ali, that speaker up there. Here, death to apartheid. Now that's interesting, death to apartheid, what do they mean there? Death to Israel. Death to apartheid, are you going to kill Israel? You're going to kill apartheid? How do you kill apartheid? You have to murder Jews. Israel, the Fourth Reich, again, the association with Nazism. And here's a mock apartheid wall where these kids dress up like Israeli soldiers and harass kids all day long. This is good theater and the students like it, but it's based on distortions. Again, Harvard and MIT, the barbed wire around Gaza as if it's a war zone. Here, never again, the Palestinian Holocaust. The Palestinians are not having a Holocaust. Their numbers have not only increased, they have better health care, they live longer lives, they have better jobs. Their state has actually improved, except for the ones that are languishing in refugee camps because none of their beloved Arab countries will take them in. But Palestinians who stayed in Israel or who work in the West Bank have benefited greatly from the advances of Israeli society. To call it a Holocaust and use the term never again, again, saying to the Jews, never again you say, well, what about the Palestinians that you're wiping out and exterminating? Gaza is not Auschwitz. Where's our, I wanted to show you a very short film. It's about 10 minutes. We'll watch 10 minutes of it. The reason I like to show this is there's some radical activist speakers who come to the University of California at Irvine. And there's also some student rallies. And I want you to see the level of anger and hatred so that we can fully understand that this is not a polite discussion about Israeli politics and borders. There's something else going on here. This is produced by Stand With Us, which is a student group that teaches students how to stand up to this kind of anti-Semitism.
Who tour college campuses and local libraries, making twisted presentations that demonize Israel. But he is not alone. There's a very long list of speakers who are sponsored by the more radical student groups and even by like-minded professors. Their lectures most often serve to demonize Israel. This is done through the telling of half-truths, distorting events, or completely rewriting history. Some say that there is no problem on campus. But it was the steady parade of anti-Israel and sometimes even anti-Semitic speakers that inspired the making of this film.
What type of affinity do you feel with a racist, occupying, expansionist, aggressive, warlike state as exists in Tel Aviv?
Zionism is a mixture, a fusion of the concept of white supremacy and the chosen people. It is a fusion of it. And that is why, when you deal with them, there's an arrogance that they have. Zionist-controlled media, and yes, it's a Zionist-controlled media. I don't have my list with me, but you know, we have all the names of who owns what and who's in charge of what. Because sometimes the Zionists will say, did you hear what he said? He said the Zionists control the media. That's anti-Semitic balderdash. Right? And then you break down all the names of who owns what, and who's in charge of what, and who's the president of what, and they just coincidentally are overwhelmingly Zionist Jews. Overwhelmingly. Two-state solution is off the table. No. One state. And check this out. One state, majority rules. One state, majority rules. Us, the Muslims.
Do you think President Bush had any political fiber in him who tell Mr. Shalom, hey buddy, enough is enough. Get off, you're a monkey that's on the American back. Get off of our back. It's about time we begin to open our eyes, see for ourselves, and identify this cancerous presence of the Israeli interest that has taken over the American body politic. Trying to point to the lethal presence of the Zionist interest within it and purge your religious or your political circle from any effects of Zionism, and the world will be a better place for all of us.
I'm a Muslim, I'm a Semite, and I'm an anti-Zionist, not an anti-Jew.
There's one racist right there.
This is the reality economic psychology. When a rare, crazed, would-be freedom fighter escapes this prison and tries to strike his oppressor, we need to read about the prison he has exploded out of. Instead of an inexplicable, fanatical terrorist, we would see what we had helped create with our aid to Israel. A terrorized victim who has tragically, but explicably, finally turned on us himself.
Everyone now agrees that Palestinians had suffered an ethnic cleansing in 1948. That was no longer a topic of dispute. So you can take somebody who's quite mainstream now, someone like Benny Morris. He wasn't then, but he is now, a quite mainstream Israeli historian. He'll acknowledge that Palestinians suffered an ethnic cleansing in 1948. And you can take historians to the left of him, and they, of course, make a similar claim.
Apartheid is real. South Africa is real. Jerusalem is real. Israel is real. New York is real. And Israel is Brooklyn. New York City Mayor Giuliani is good friends with the mayor of Jerusalem. He was the first person the mayor called after 9/11. It makes sense. Both cities are built upon burned out remains. Tel Aviv made on the grave of refugees like African slaves buried under the World Trade.
You know the kind of stuff that they're doing, the type of spy network that they have in this country. Stand up to them. Professors, they got people coming in your classes. If you're a professor, and if you take a position against the apartheid state of Israel, they got snitches coming to your classroom. Because what is taking place in Iraq has everything to do with the apartheid state of Israel. And now these neocons, these Zionist Jews who are in the Pentagon and who are in other branches of the administration are telling George Bush, now go into Iran and then go into Syria. So UCI has been a campus that has stood up against this Zionist mentality, that has challenged them. And the Zionists are not used to being challenged in this way. They're not used to it. They're used to people being afraid of them. I might lose my job. You can't say that. You can't do that. They might get mad. The Jews might get mad. They're talking about the Zionist Jews. They might get angry. They might get, you can't say that. So politicians have to kowtow to them.
Intolerance and hate speech at Concordia University did in fact escalate into violence in 2002 when Benjamin Netanyahu was invited to speak on that campus.
Your life is not fair? When I took your flag, it's not fair enough, but when you think our lives, it's fair?
Here we see an Arab student publicly harassing a Jewish student.
This way, I'm not giving you up. I'll show you more.
Here, the mob surrounds a Jewish student. They ripped his flag away from him and stomped on it.
So there's a level of visceral anger there that is disturbing because, and you saw dollar signs on the map, and you saw the Star of David. This isn't just about, and that Malik Ali was carefully saying Zionist Jews. Well, what are the kind of, in his mind, all Jews are Zionists. And this other, I have advocated, although not terribly publicly, I've mentioned it to some colleagues, that I think that we should try to divest ourselves of the word Zionism, because that also has been hijacked. It is now like communism or Nazism or socialism. It has a pejorative term to it. Zionism was just the longing to rebuild Jerusalem and to go back, to go home spiritually and physically. And it's happened. Israel exists. So But you see that the perception of Zionism and the way it's portrayed in this false narrative, the Palestinian narrative, is of some fascist, militaristic, racist kind of creed that is making Jews do all of these horrible things to the Palestinians in the name of that Zionistic creed. How are we doing with time? Okay. I'll only take easy questions or friendly ones.
Several years ago, I read an article that the Union of Professors in England wanted to restrict Israeli students and professors from attending and teaching at the university system in England. I happen to have a nephew who is a professor in England, and I asked him about it, and he said that it barely lost, that they were very much trying to do that.
Yes. This year we had a very interesting case. Some of you might have read about it. There was, in England, there was a math professor, Ronnie Fraser. He was the member of the teachers union there, the UCU. And the whole union had been hijacked by these radicals who detest Israel and were trying to do these boycott calls, and he felt so intimidated because of what he perceived to be the latent, if not blatant, anti-Semitism of the union with their obsession with Israel and the demonization that they were trying to do to Israel, that he went to court and took the case to court to try to get a hearing about whether they were in fact being discriminatory and breaking the law by being anti-Semitic. And the court found in the union's favor, unfortunately. And basically, I thought it was very disingenuous what the court said. They basically blamed the victim because they said, well, you brought it up. If you hadn't come to court talking about the anti-Semitism, there never would have been this case. And the court also said something that was very telling in their findings, that just because you were talking about Israel, Israel has nothing to do with being Jewish, which I thought was a pretty dramatic and sweeping generalization for a court to make. But he lost the case, and basically they said to him, you kind of got what you asked for, because if you want to accuse people of being anti-Semitic, then they're going to fight back. They didn't feel that the union itself was doing anything wrong about it. England has a huge problem with anti-Semitism, and the schools do as well. And they've also, as I said, in mentioning Melanie Phillips, they've embraced a lot of Muslim culture, and there's a lot of radical Muslim speakers that come to the schools now. And every year on Holocaust Memorial Day, the Arabs in Britain they want to do away with that holiday. Because they say there's other Holocausts, why are we paying attention to this one? It's subtle things like that, but it's still a problem.
And it's coming here too. I mean, that right there.
One second. Your very articulate program is terrifying, as was Edwin Black last week, and Matthew Lovett last year, and Steve Emerson, who I've heard speak, and I get letters from continuously. It appeared my brothers and my nieces and nephews are doctors in Israel. They've been there for over 35 years. And it seems to me that what you're saying is that the light at the end of the tunnel is an oncoming train. And I hear what you're saying, but and this is not an easy question, Tony, what can we possibly do to change the minds of these people. I mean, they are obviously the majority.
I'm in this every day, as some of you in this room. I am, because I'm on a listserv and I get 150 emails a day, and all we talk about is these issues. It's a tidal wave, and it is frightening. What we can do is the kind of thing that happened when the American Studies Association in December called for a boycott against Israeli academics. What was their reason? Because they claim, and the MLA was supporting this, they claim that the university system in Israel is part and parcel of the occupation, and that the academics in the institution of higher education are complicit in the occupation, and therefore, because they're in control of it, or they should be able to tell their government what to do, or they haven't spoken out against it, they should be blamed and be held accountable. So the ASA said, we're calling for a boycott of academic institutions in Israel. It's a horrible thing to do, because what you're doing is applying a political litmus test on academics. First of all, it's contrary to the idea of academic freedom. Who cares? You know, do you think when George Bush invaded Iraq that American scholars, 90% of whom are liberals and Democrats, would have liked it if Europe had boycotted them because of the actions of our government? It depends on who the government is at the particular time. And there's something inimical and kind of distorted and repulsive about basing academic loyalty on what a government is doing and banishing only Jewish scholars from the world of academia. You know, again, there's something about it that's smelly. It doesn't seem like it's being done with pure virtue, because there's a lot of other countries that are doing far worse things where their governments could be held accountable and the academics could share in that blame before Israel.